Well, today's last day. Benjamin gets to be with us. And kind of sad for Kathy and me. But I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot of things with Ben this summer. I learned about bingo. I really hadn't played bingo professionally. So we went over to the Riverboat Bingo Entertainment Center. Said it opened like at 11 a.m. and so we got there at like 5 of 11 and there were all these cars and these people have been there since like 10. So we go in and we're going to learn about bingo. The little daubers. They lent us a dauber. But we sat down at this table. We counted. There was over 100 people and we started looking at the bingo card. There were going to be over 20 bingo games. And so we're sitting there, we get everything organized, and we start playing bingo for 3 hours. I'm telling you, 3 hours of bingo. I left after 3 hours with a headache. Okay. So we're playing. And over on this table to the left of us is this woman, sitting on the end, very cool, calm, and collective. And go around game 4, bingo! Around game 11, bingo! Around game 17, bingo! Around 19 or so, bingo! Now, Ben and I sat there with the other 100 other people. We won 0 times. Now, in the very last game, Ben only needed a 20, and he would have been able to yell bingo, but he didn't get it. So we won 0 times. That lady, she won 4 times. It's not fair. It's over at Walmart here the other day. Picked out a line to get into a lane, the cashiers. 3 people in front of me. 3 people. I only had 5 things. No express lane. Absolutely no express lane. I don't know what the person at the head of my line was doing. Paying with pennies. Looking for coupons, seeing if the thing they wanted was available. I don't know, but I stood there and I watched as the other 3 people processed through in the other lane and left, and 3 more people got in line. And as I'm standing there, 2 ladies get behind me. Their carts are overflowing with stuff. And I'm standing there waiting. And finally, somebody gets wind of this in the Walmart store, and they're going to come over and open up another lane. They invite us in our lane to get over there. You should have seen those 2 women move. Whoa! They were out of there before I was out of there. It's not fair. Well, isn't that the way you feel when you read Jesus' parable here in Matthew 20? I mean, Jesus often told parables with surprise endings. And one terrific example is this parable. More than likely, it takes place probably around late September, when the grapes would have been ripe in Palestine. It would have been a race against time because they need to harvest these grapes before the harsh October rains. So every available person in the community would be employed for a few days to make sure that the grapes are all harvested before those rains come. So very early in the morning, the owner of this particular vineyard, he goes to the marketplace. He wants to find some able-bodied workers. It's kind of like when you drive down Grand and you see there at Greenway, I don't know, all these people just standing there waiting to be employed for the day. And this is what it would have been like in the marketplace back then. Work was hard. But the landowner promised the people he hired early in the morning he would pay his workers well for their efforts. He was going to give them a good daily wage, which would have been about 1 silver coin. After a couple of hours, however, the landowner's kind of surveying the whole situation, and he realizes that at the rate that the ones that are working in the vineyard are going, he's not going to get all of his grapes harvested, so he goes back to the marketplace. Found some other men. They were just standing around. They weren't doing anything. He asked them if they wanted to be employed. They gladly accepted, and he says, I'm going to pay you whatever is right. So they went to work in the vineyard. Later, he realized he still needed more workers. He realized this at noon. He realizes this at 3 o'clock. He hires more laborers at the marketplace. He still isn't going to make it. So he goes back even 1 hour before quitting time. He hires a group and brings them out to the vineyard. And in the end, we don't know if they got it all done, but it appears as if they got all the work finished. That's not the problem. The problem is quitting time, when everybody gets paid. The workers who were hired at 5 o'clock, 1 hour before quitting time, who had only worked, maybe in the cool of the evening, they were paid first, and they were paid 1 silver coin. That was what you would have expected for working the entire day. And the workers who had worked the entire day in the hot sun, they looked on in amazement. If they're going to get a silver coin for 1 hour of work, just imagine what we're going to receive. But they were in for disappointment. In fact, the Greek, if you really put some emotion into it, they were outraged. They were outraged, for they received the exact same amount as those who had worked only 1 hour. They received 1 silver coin. How dare the landowner pay them the same amount as those who had worked fewer hours? It wasn't fair. Of course, the parable isn't really about harvesting grapes. The parable is about one spiritual truth, about the kingdom of God. The one spiritual truth that's being talked about here is grace. And this parable, it says loudly and clearly that grace cannot be earned. The workers in the vineyard expressed their outrage to the owner in the vineyard. These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. And they really laid it on thick about how upset they were. They wanted to get more out of the landowner. Landowner had to admit he was taken a little bit by surprise. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. He promised them 1 day's wage for 1 day's work. And that's what he paid them. He paid them what he had promised. Friend, the landowner replied to one of those disgruntled workers, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree at the beginning of the day to work for the usual daily wage? And it was true. Of course it was true. They got paid what he promised to pay them. The landowner did not cheat them in any way. He did no wrong. And he simply asked the question of them, and a very interesting question, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And here's an important lesson about the grace of God. God's grace is a gift. And God can do with it what he wills. See, the Bible teaches us that God is not as we would expect God to be. As we learn about him throughout the scriptures, even in the Old Testament, we discover God isn't like us. He doesn't think like we think. He doesn't respond to things as we respond. He doesn't do things as we do them. Long ago, the prophet Isaiah, Linda read this passage at the beginning of the service. He said, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And this morning we discover yet another example of how God's ways are higher than our ways, and how his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. It's found in this parable. The workers in the vineyard. And the best thing we could do this morning is to learn God's way. We need to learn God's way. We need to have the mind of God. And we must replace our way with God's way. Once read a story about an African-American man who's lived in this particular neighborhood, and his house had not received much attention over the years, so finally he decided it needed a fresh new coating of paint. So he paid to have his house painted, completely redone. It looked beautiful. 3 days after he had his house painted, he woke up one morning, walked outside, and saw graffiti all over that freshly painted house. First, he thought it was racially motivated. Someone did not like him living in their neighborhood. And so he started asking around in hopes of discovering who would have spoiled his house in this way. And he found that the graffiti was placed on his house by an 11-year-old white boy. And really, it wasn't racially motivated. It was simply a childhood prank, or at least that's what this 11-year-old thought. Like toilet papering a tree, but a little bit more expensive. Now, what would you do? What would you do if you discovered your newly painted house covered with graffiti? What would God do? Would you do what you would do, or would you do what God would do? Suppose the culprit was an 11-year-old boy. Would you call the police? Would you at least go over and talk to the boy's parents and demand that they intervene? Would there be a lawsuit? After all, somebody's going to have to pay for the damage. This was expensive to paint my house. What would you do? Punishment or grace? The man who was wrong could have made a big issue out of it. Instead, he decided to try to get to know this 11-year-old boy better. He was unsure of what would happen, but he was willing to try. And thus here was this black man and a young white boy, and as they began to talk and to chat, they actually soon became friends. And instead of taking the boy and his parents to court, he decided to offer the boy to learn about computers, because that's what the man did for a living. He did computer work. And the news showed, this was on the news, the boy sitting at the computer in the man's house, the same house he had put graffiti upon. And the reporter asked him about the graffiti. And the boy, with tears streaming down his face, said he was sorry for what he had done. In fact, when he did it, he didn't even know why he did it other than something to do. And then he said, Mr. Stevens, and that was the black man, and I are friends now. And he has taught me about computers. Now that is somewhat of a surprise ending, is it not? There is a surprise at the end of this story, just like there was a surprise at the end of Jesus' parable, and the surprise is grace. Grace should make us happy. When we hear that word grace, we are often happy that God would be willing to forgive us. But so often when grace surprises us, and it isn't offered to us, but it's offered to someone else, you know what the response is? It makes us mad. It makes us angry. Maybe even wanting to complain, it's not fair. You might have expected to see this young boy scrubbing the graffiti off the house, or giving the house a new coat of paint. You might have expected the parents to ground him for a month for his offense, but you never would have expected to see him in this man's den working on his computer. Grace. It's God's way. It's not our way. Our way should be God's way. But the question is it? Whether we have been in the family of God for a long time, since our childhood, or maybe we're just a recent arrival, see, the benefits of faith are the same. God is not interested actually in being just. He seeks to be generous with his grace. Life isn't fair. But God's grace is abundant. There's a rock group. When you were younger, by the name of Genesis, had a song. It's entitled, No Son of Mine. The story tells of a son, leaves the home under a cloud. He feels that if he doesn't leave, he'll never grow. He'll never become mature. And as he gets older, he does mature. Now he wants to go back home. He wants to be reconciled with his dad. He goes home, holding his heart out in his hand to his father. And his father rejects him. He says, "You're no son of mine." And that's where the title of the song comes from. That's fair. That's fair. As far as this father was concerned in this Genesis song, it was payback time. The boy had rejected his father. Now the father would do the same. You've made your bed. Go lie in it. That's one kind of father. But there's another. A certain father had 4 children. They weren't going to bed when they were supposed to go to bed, so he finally said, last one up those stairs to the bedroom is going to get a licking. And they all took off. But you know what? The 6-year-old knew she's getting the licking because her siblings were 9, 13, and 16 years old. How in the world was she going to beat them up the stairs? And when she realized that she was the last one up, she slowly and dejectedly headed back down the stairs. Went into the living room, sat down next to her dad for what seemed like an eternity. And then he looked over at her and said, "Are you ready for your licking?" Yeah. The father leaned over and gave her a lick on the cheek. He chuckled and then he sent her to bed. Jesus' parable reminds us that no matter how hard we try, we never deserve God's grace. Never. It's a free gift. It doesn't matter how long or how hard we work. It doesn't matter how pious our demeanor. We cannot earn God's love. We cannot earn God's compassion. We cannot earn God's grace because it's simply poured out by God on us freely. On us all. And yet by our reaction to the parable, many of us wish it were not so. But I'm so glad it is. We might as well face it. Many of us have served Christ for a number of years. And you know what? When it comes time to hand out those crowns of righteousness that we read about in 2 Timothy, we hope that we get a bonus because we've been working longer and harder than so many others. We've been laboring. Now, Jesus faced the same dilemma. When he walked this earth, he was criticized for spending too much time with tax collectors and with sinners, not spending enough time with the respectable folk. Respectable folks didn't like Jesus spending time with sinners. It's amazing how quick we are to judge other people's situations. The Bible teaches us that only God is qualified to judge. Only God knows the heart. He sees the heart. He knows the inner person. And when God renders his verdict, forgiven, no matter what stage of life it comes, it's total and absolute. Since none of us are deserving of such a verdict, all of us are deserving equally of God's grace. Whether or not we've been a Christian since our childhood, or if we've been a Christian just in the last couple of years. And here's the good news for the day. You and I have a great opportunity. We can be agents of grace on God's behalf if we choose. Place yourself for a moment, not with the workers. Rather, how about put yourself in the sandals of that person who got to pay the workers that day? Can you imagine the joy on the people's faces who had only worked an hour that day and received that silver coin? Paul tells us that life is a race. We went to Disney 2 Januaries ago, and we're having a blast. It was so not crowded. I love it when it's not crowded. But Friday, it was crowded. And what happened? What happened between Thursday and Friday? Friday, they ran a half marathon. And Saturday, they ran a full marathon. And there were all these people. I would say thousands of people. And if you want to get in that race, you have to get in that race like 3 days after the registration opens, about 9 months before the race. That's how quickly it sells out. Now, Benjamin likes to run. And we thought, hey, that would be a really cool thing for Benjamin to run in that race sometime and then get a medal. Well, I have my Mickey award, but you actually get a medal if you run in this marathon. And it's really pretty impressive. And if you run in both of them, you get one that's entitled the Goofy Medal. Because you got to be goofy to run both of them 2 days in a row. But I'm just thinking, back here, Chuck and Pat, would you stand up for just a moment and help me out? Let's say that Chuck and Pat, and I'll tell you, I've watched them, they love each other. They love each other immensely. Say that 9 months before the next marathon, you sign up and we'll do the half marathon. We'll start out simple. And you sign up, and Chuck is so fired up, I can't wait to run this half marathon because he loves Disney. Pat, she's excited. Yeah, I'm looking forward to running this with you. So Chuck, he goes out, and he begins to prepare for this marathon, 9 months ahead of time. And he runs a block. You know what happens after a block? But he runs in the cool of the spring. And each day he gets going a little further and a little further. And every day he comes home and says, Pat, you want to run with me? No, not today. I've got, what's that game? Bunko. I got Bunko to do. I've got this other thing to do. But Chuck, he runs and he runs and he runs. He runs through the heat of the summer, a scorching heat. And even in the heat of the summer now, he's able to run like 10 miles. And he runs, and he comes back every day and says, Pat, you want to go run with? Not today. Not today. Now let's fast forward. And we get to what? 2 weeks before? Chuck's ready to go. And Pat all of a sudden dawns on her, it's 2 weeks away. Chuck, I don't think I can do this. I really don't think I can do this. Well, you got to try. You know how much it costs to get into this thing? You've got to try. And so Pat goes out, and she does a little bit of running, and they get her running shoes and that fancy running outfit, right? Looks really cool. But Pat only has 2 weeks now to prepare. And they get there to Disney, and the day of the race has come. And they're standing at the starting line, and Pat says to Chuck, hey, you have put your heart and soul into this. You run as you've never run before. I'll get to the end. Somehow I'll get to the end. So Chuck, he takes off. He leaves Pat behind. I don't know. 2 hours and 45 minutes later, Chuck crosses the finish line. And he stands and he waits. Pat's been running. She's been walking. She's been running. She's been crawling. 3 hours and 30 minutes after the start of the race, she crosses the line. He's run it faster than Pat. He worked 9 months in the scorching heat. Pat, 2 weeks. She walked most of it. And it comes time to hand out the medals. And Chuck gets the exact same medal as Pat. Is he outraged? Is he mad? I hope not. He loves her. I know. I told you how much he loves her. He wanted her to run the race and finish it and get that medal. He celebrates with her. Thank you. Life is a race. We're surrounded by people we love, and maybe even some people we don't, but we should love them. That's what it says. We should love them all. And some of us have been preparing and working in the race all our lives. And then others just jump in at the end. Don't get mad that God has showered his love and grace upon them and that they're going to be in heaven with us. Be glad. Be glad. And for those who aren't preparing yet and aren't working towards it, be an example. Be an encouragement. Tell them how much you love them and tell them about God's grace. It's a tough parable. It's really tough. Give it some thought this week.